They arrived on American soil not as conquerors, but as captives. The salty Atlantic wind carried more than just the smell of the sea. It carried the bitter taste of defeat. Through the portholes of troop ships, German prisoners of war caught their first glimpse of America, expecting to find the harsh, vengeful nation their propaganda had promised. What they saw instead would shatter every belief they held about their enemies. The massive ports of Norfolk, New York, and Boston stretched before them like mechanical giants. Cranes reached skyward, warehouses bulged with goods, and trains rolled endlessly along gleaming tracks. For men who had spent years dodging bombs in ruined cities, this abundance seemed impossible. How could a nation at war possess such plenty while their own homeland lay in ashes? Under military guard, they boarded trains bound for camps scattered across the American heartland. As the locomotive pulled away from the coast, windows revealed landscapes that defied comprehension. Endless cornfields stretched to the horizon, unmarked by craters. Small towns nestled peacefully beneath church spires, their streets untouched by war. Children played on sidewalks, while mothers hung laundry in backyards, scenes of normalcy that seemed lifted from another world. The prisoners whispered among themselves, sharing fears and desperate hopes. Some expected immediate execution, remembering Allied propaganda that painted all Germans as monsters. Others hoped merely to survive long enough to see home again. But as the train carried them deeper into America's heartland, they began to witness something that confused and unnerved them. Curious Americans gathering at stations, not with hatred in their eyes, but with something closer to bewilderment. Children pointed, women stared, and occasionally someone even waved. This was not the America they had been taught to fear. This was something far more dangerous to their understanding of the world. This was a land that seemed untouched by the hatred that had consumed Europe. The camps themselves defied every expectation the German prisoners had harbored about American vengeance. Instead of dungeons or execution grounds, they found orderly compounds built on open farmland, rows of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire. But behind that wire lay a world that challenged everything they thought they knew about captivity. Each man received his own bunk, warm blankets, and 3 meals a day that exceeded anything German civilians were receiving back home. The food alone astonished them. Real meat, fresh bread, milk, and fruit, luxuries that had disappeared from German tables years before. Some prisoners later wrote that their first American meal contained more protein than they had eaten in months on the Eastern Front. The daily routine was structured but humane. Dawn brought bugle calls and roll call, followed by breakfast in mess halls, where eggs, porridge, and even butter appeared on their plates. Afternoons were filled with work assignments, language classes, and recreational activities. The Americans seemed determined to keep them occupied, establishing workshops where prisoners could repair shoes, craft furniture, and even form orchestras. Medical care shocked them most profoundly. Each camp maintained clean infirmaries staffed by American doctors, and prisoners received dental care, vaccinations, and treatment for ailments they had endured for years. Men who had marched through mud with infected wounds now found themselves in beds with fresh sheets, receiving medicines they had only dreamed of. The guards, too, defied expectations. These young American soldiers, many barely older than the prisoners themselves, maintained discipline without cruelty. There were no beatings, no starvation, no systematic brutality. When news arrived of atrocities in Europe, tensions would spike briefly, but the camps operated with routine professionalism rather than vengeance. As weeks passed, the prisoners' initial terror gave way to cautious acceptance. The barbed wire remained, but life within it proved unexpectedly bearable. They had access to German books, American newspapers, and even movies. For many, this became their first real exposure to American culture beyond Nazi propaganda. and what they discovered challenged every assumption they had carried across the ocean about their captor's character. As 1943 stretched into 1944, America's labor shortage reached critical levels. With millions of men deployed overseas, farms across the Midwest and South faced an impossible choice: let crops rot in the fields or find alternative sources of labor. The solution came in the form of a carefully regulated program that would forever change how German prisoners viewed their captors: supervised work assignments beyond the camp fences. The first time trucks arrived to transport prisoners to local farms, tension crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. American farmers, many of whom had sons fighting Germans in North Africa and Italy, found themselves face to face with the enemy they had known only through newspaper photographs and war bond posters. For the Germans, stepping beyond the familiar boundaries of the camps felt like entering uncharted territory, yet necessity breeds strange partnerships. Farmers quickly discovered that many prisoners possessed invaluable agricultural skills. These were men who had grown up working the rich soils of Bavaria, Saxony, and Prussia. They handled plows with practiced ease, understood livestock, and approached physical labor with the methodical efficiency that had once made the German army formidable. Local communities watched with fascination as their preconceived notions crumbled. The fearsome Nazi soldiers of propaganda transformed into young men who whistled folk tunes while milking cows, who carefully repaired broken equipment, and who showed genuine concern for injured animals. Children, initially hiding behind their mothers' skirts, gradually grew bold enough to approach these strangers who carved wooden toys during lunch breaks and shared small pieces of bread with farm dogs. Payment came through government vouchers redeemable at camp canteens, but farmers often supplemented this with small kindnesses: a fresh apple pressed into calloused hands, a thermos of cold water on scorching days, or slices of homemade pie shared under the shade of barn eaves. These gestures, small as they seemed, carried profound weight for men who had expected only hostility from enemy civilians. In Kansas wheat fields and Nebraska cornfields, in Texas cotton patches and Minnesota dairy farms, a quiet transformation was taking place. The sight of German prisoners became routine: trucks arriving at dawn, men climbing down with tools in hand, the day's labor unfolding under American skies. Guards remained present, but often at respectful distances, recognizing that the prisoners had little incentive to escape into a vast, unfamiliar continent where they would be strangers speaking a foreign tongue. As summer turned to autumn, something unexpected began to happen. The boundaries between captor and captive, between enemy and neighbor, began to blur in ways that would have been unimaginable just months before. The first invitation came like a whisper, hesitant and almost accidental. After a particularly exhausting day harvesting corn in Iowa, a farmer's wife appeared at the edge of the field carrying a pitcher of cold milk and a plate of sandwiches. "You boys look tired," she said to the guard, but her eyes lingered on the German prisoners who had worked steadily through the sweltering afternoon. What began as refreshment under an oak tree evolved into something more profound. As trust grew through weeks of reliable work and respectful behavior, barriers that had seemed insurmountable began to lower. A farmer in Minnesota, watching a young German prisoner carefully tend to a sick calf, found himself thinking less about nationality and more about character. When the man's gentle ministration saved the animal's life, the farmer's perspective shifted irrevocably. The transition from field hospitality to household welcome happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. A cup of coffee on the porch became a sandwich at the kitchen table. A sandwich became an invitation to join the family for a proper meal. For German prisoners who had not seen the inside of a civilian home in years, stepping across American thresholds felt like entering another world entirely. The homes themselves told stories of abundance that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had proclaimed about American decadence and weakness. These were modest farmhouses, certainly, but they contained luxuries that had vanished from German homes years before. Electric lights that worked consistently, running water, pantries stocked with preserved foods, and ice boxes filled with fresh dairy products. More striking than material comfort was the atmosphere of warmth and normalcy. Family photographs lined mantelpieces, showing fathers in uniform overseas and children at school pageants. Radio programs provided gentle background music instead of air raid sirens. The conversation around dinner tables focused on harvest prospects and community news rather than blackout procedures and casualty reports. American families found themselves surprised by their guests' humanity. These were not the monsters of propaganda, but young men who spoke fondly of mothers and sisters, who worried about families under Allied bombing, and who possessed the same universal concerns about home and future that transcended national boundaries. Some prisoners spoke sufficient English to hold conversations, while others relied on gestures and smiles to bridge linguistic gaps. For families of German ancestry, communication flowed more easily, with familiar dialects creating unexpected connections. The sound of Bavarian German or Plattdeutsch in an American kitchen created moments of profound recognition, reminding everyone present that the boundaries of war were often more artificial than the bonds of shared heritage and human experience. The transformation of Sunday from just another day to something sacred represented the pinnacle of this extraordinary hospitality. In rural America, Sunday carried special significance, a day when fields rested, families gathered, and homes filled with the aromas of elaborate meals prepared with love and ceremony. For German prisoners accustomed to military rations and institutional cooking, Sunday dinner invitations offered glimpses of American life at its most intimate and generous. Tables set with white linens and polished silverware, candles flickering in crystal holders, and the careful arrangement of serving dishes created scenes that seemed almost theatrical to men who had lived so long in the utilitarian world of barracks and mess halls. The meals themselves overwhelmed prisoners who had grown accustomed to scarcity. Roasted chickens emerged from ovens golden and fragrant, accompanied by mountains of mashed potatoes enriched with real butter and cream. Vegetables came from family gardens, fresh and abundant, while desserts, apple pies, chocolate cakes, and fruit cobblers provided sweetness that many had not tasted in years. But the food, abundant as it was, represented only part of the experience. The ritual of gathering, the tradition of prayer before meals, and the inclusion of strangers in family ceremonies demonstrated values that transcended national boundaries. When American mothers bowed their heads and offered thanks for food and safety, including blessings for those far from home, German prisoners often found themselves moved to tears by the generosity of spirit. Children played crucial roles in breaking down remaining barriers. American boys and girls, curious and unafraid, asked questions about Germany, requested demonstrations of folk songs, and begged for stories about castles and forests they had seen in picture books. Prisoners, many of whom had left children behind, found themselves disarmed by innocent inquiry and eager to share harmless memories of their homeland's beauty. One Nebraska family preserved the memory of a prisoner who carved a small wooden horse from firewood, presenting it to their 6-year-old daughter with ceremony that suggested he was thinking of his own child an ocean away. The toy became a treasured keepsake, surviving decades as a tangible reminder of humanity discovered in the most unlikely circumstances. Religious observance provided another bridge between former enemies. Many prisoners were Christian, and they recognized familiar elements in American worship despite denominational differences. When invited to attend church services, they often felt uncomfortable under congregational scrutiny, but they were struck by the absence of hatred in sermons. American pastors spoke of forgiveness, compassion, and faith in human goodness, themes that contrasted sharply with the ideological fervor they had encountered in wartime Germany. These Sunday gatherings became the emotional and spiritual center of the prisoners' American experience, representing everything they had not expected to find in enemy territory: acceptance, generosity, and recognition of shared humanity despite the artificial divisions created by war. Sunday afternoons stretched long and golden, filled with conversations that bridged cultural divides through music, stories, and shared experiences. In living rooms across rural America, German harmonicas and accordions provided accompaniment to folk songs that spoke of distant mountains and ancient traditions. American families listened with fascination as melodies transported them to alpine meadows and Rhine Valley vineyards, while prisoners struggled to master the rhythms of American hymns and popular songs. Food became a vehicle for cultural exchange as German prisoners shared memories of traditional recipes and cooking techniques. A Texas family learned to prepare sauerkraut using methods passed down through generations of Bavarian grandmothers, while their guests discovered the complex pleasures of barbecue and chili that initially challenged European palates, but eventually won converts. These exchanges revealed the profound similarities beneath surface differences. Stories shared around American dinner tables spoke of harvest festivals that echoed German Oktoberfest celebrations, of Christmas traditions that varied in detail but shared essential themes of family gathering and gift-giving, and of folk tales that seemed to spring from universal human experiences rather than national literatures. Children served as natural ambassadors, requesting fairy tales that prisoners recounted in accented English, stories of Hansel and Gretel, Rumpelstiltskin, and the Brothers Grimm that American children recognized from their own bedtime readings. These shared narratives proved that cultures separated by war still carried echoes of common inheritance, that the stories humans tell their young transcend political boundaries. Conversations about the war itself required delicate navigation, but they occurred nonetheless. American families wanted to understand life in wartime Germany, while prisoners cautiously described the destruction of cities and the scarcity of basic necessities without delving into political ideology. These mutual confessions revealed common struggles: rationing, blackouts, fear for loved ones serving far from home, that proved suffering and sacrifice were universal experiences rather than the exclusive burden of any single nation. Letters from home, shared cautiously, revealed the human cost of global conflict. American mothers showed photographs of sons serving in the Pacific or European theaters, while German prisoners spoke carefully of families enduring Allied bombing campaigns. These exchanges, painful as they were, demonstrated that loss and worry crossed all battle lines, that mothers everywhere shared the same fears and hopes, regardless of the uniforms their children wore. Music provided the most immediate and emotionally powerful form of connection. German folk songs performed on Sunday afternoons carried melodies that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to the heart. Die Lorelei and O Tannenbaum evoked responses from American audiences who found beauty in sounds that transcended language barriers. In return, prisoners listened with growing appreciation to American spirituals, country ballads, and popular songs that revealed the emotional landscape of their host's culture. These cultural bridges, built across Sunday dinner tables and in front of family radios, created bonds that would endure long after the war's end. They represented something unprecedented in military history: a sustained period of intimate contact between enemies that revealed shared humanity beneath the artificial divisions of nationality and ideology. As 1945 dawned and news of Germany's impending surrender began to circulate, The relationships forged in American kitchens and living rooms had already begun to reshape how participants viewed concepts of enemy and friend, foreigner and neighbor. When Germany's surrender became official in May 1945, the long process of repatriation began, but the memories created during years of unexpected hospitality would prove more durable than the military structures that had brought these men together. Ships that had once carried captives westward now reversed course, bearing former prisoners eastward toward a homeland transformed by defeat and occupation. The Germany they found bore little resemblance to the nation they had left. Cities lay in ruins, families struggled with starvation, and the political order that had defined their world had collapsed entirely. In this landscape of devastation, stories of American abundance and kindness seemed almost mythical. Yet prisoner after prisoner recounted similar experiences, tales of Sunday dinners, of families who had opened their doors to enemies, of abundance that persisted even during wartime. These accounts contradicted the propaganda that had shaped German understanding of their enemies for over a decade. The America described by returning prisoners was not the morally corrupt, militaristically brutal nation of Nazi imagery, but a place where strangers extended hospitality to those they had every reason to hate. Such testimonies, shared quietly among families and communities, began to reshape German perceptions of their former enemies and create psychological foundations for eventual reconciliation. Some prisoners maintained correspondence with American families who had hosted them, creating transatlantic friendships that survived the challenges of international mail and cultural differences. Letters crossed the ocean carrying news of German reconstruction efforts and American harvests, of marriages and births, of the ordinary details of life resuming its peaceful rhythms after years of global conflict. In the 1950s and 1960s, a remarkable phenomenon began to occur. Former prisoners returned to America as tourists and immigrants, standing once again at the thresholds of homes where they had once been welcomed as reluctant guests. Families who had shared their Sunday tables with young men in uniform now embraced middle-aged visitors who spoke of gratitude that had grown rather than diminished with time. These return visits confirmed that the hospitality experienced during captivity had represented something more profound than temporary charity. It had been an expression of values that transcended the immediate circumstances of war, values that could serve as building blocks for lasting peace between former enemies. The children who had carved wooden toys and shared fairy tales during those long-ago Sunday afternoons grew into adults who carried forward lessons about the humanity that persists even in times of conflict. Many credited their wartime experiences with American families as pivotal in shaping their understanding of tolerance, forgiveness, and the possibility of friendship across cultural and national boundaries. In academic circles, historians began to recognize these personal relationships as significant factors in post-war German-American reconciliation. The Marshall Plan and NATO alliance provided political and economic frameworks for cooperation, but the emotional foundation had been laid years earlier around dinner tables in Iowa and Texas, in conversations between former enemies who had discovered their shared humanity. The legacy extended beyond individual relationships to influence broader cultural attitudes. German communities that had received returning prisoners carried forward stories of American generosity that shaped local perspectives on international relations and cultural exchange. These narratives became part of family traditions, passed down through generations as reminders that even the most bitter conflicts need not preclude eventual understanding and friendship. Today, museums and archives preserve letters, photographs, and artifacts from this unique chapter in military history. Wooden toys carved by homesick prisoners, recipes exchanged between German and American women, and correspondence that spanned decades all testify to the power of simple human kindness to transcend the artificial boundaries created by war and politics. The German prisoners who once sat at American Sunday dinner tables had experienced something unprecedented in military history, captivity that became a pathway to understanding rather than deeper enmity. Their stories remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual acts of compassion can plant seeds of reconciliation that flourish long after the guns have fallen silent and the uniforms have been put away forever. In the quiet rooms where families gather for Sunday meals today, the echoes of that extraordinary hospitality continue to resonate, a testament to the enduring power of human kindness to overcome the divisions that politics and war seek to make permanent.